Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final keynote of Spring Q20, our virtual experience. It is my pleasure to have a conversation with Ken Shelton today, ISTE Digital Equity Award winner. Ken and I met about 10 years ago at the first Q Rockstar Camp on a hike to Glacier Point. We had an incredible experience there, Ken, right? Remember the parachutes, or the hang gliders?
Hang glider, that's right.
The
Yes.
hang
Yeah. That was
gliders.
our little photo safari. Yep, I
Yeah,
do.
that's exactly what it was. And we kept in touch via Twitter and social media over the years, but it's just been this past year that we've reconnected in person and found that we have a really strong shared value system in the work that we are doing. And you've been helping different departments of education develop policy around equity and tequity, and you've been presenting across the United States and have had a very powerful voice.
Yeah, it's been one. I'm glad we are reconnected, and for those listening, this is one of the beauties of technology is that even though it's been almost 10 years, we still remained obviously connected through a digital means, and it's definitely a privilege to be able to spend this time with you. And we do have a lot of shared values, and I've had the privilege of doing a lot of learning and a lot of growing in the 10 years that I've seen you. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of those with our audience here for sure. You know,
You and I have had some great conversations of what it means to be a student of color in a classroom with a
yes,
predominantly Anglo curriculum. And we've had conversations of what does it mean to be a black man teaching in a system of mostly white women, and God love us. um, but there's something that happens in the background when we aren't given the opportunity to interact with the stories that define our own histories and see people that look like us and have shared backgrounds.
it's true. And the sad part is I'm not. I know that educators are becoming more aware of it. The privilege that I've had and opportunities I've been afforded is around the increasing of the awareness, as well as the acknowledgement of that, but more specifically supporting the professional growth in those areas. It's one of the things I always tell educators at the start of any of the workshops that I lead, or even some of the talks that I do, is the first step is the awareness aspect. And so when you there are many things, even just sharing with you, even early in my career, there are many things that I did that, it wasn't until I had an awareness of how those might not be beneficial to my students, or they certainly weren't providing equitable access for opportunity. Once I became aware of them, I made the adjustment. But, the thing with educators in general, whether they're a classroom teacher, a school site leader, school district leader, is being able to develop some sort of a mechanism to identify some of the thinking gaps we have, or some of the cultural norms that can lead to obstacles being in the way of many of our students, that we as educators who are looking at equity and looking at opportunities, we can begin to dismantle those obstacles that are in place.
And you made a really good point about some of those gaps that we have in there when we talk about equity, because equity has become the term du jour. It's a bit of a buzzword right now. And we do have different definitions of what equity means. I had the opportunity to lead several workshops, so you've done way more than I have, where we start with the question, then what does equity mean to you? Write it down and then share it in a group. And I have yet to be a part of any group where within a small group, even more than one person, 2 or 3 people, have the same definition of equity. So
Right.
from your point of view, what does equity mean?
So let's start off with equality. And in what would have been the face-to-face keynote at Q, there's a graphic that I shared that I know a lot of folks have seen, where it shows essentially these kids behind a fence looking at a baseball game. And so the equality is all of them are provided a box, but all of the children, if you will, in that are not of the same height. And so equality is they all have a box, yet not all of them have access or opportunity, those are the key words, to essentially observe the match or the game that's taking place. Equity is the boxes are now distributed in a way that they all are, their heads are above the fence to where they all have access and opportunity to see the baseball game. And so ultimately, I simply define equity as access and opportunity. How are we ensuring access that provides opportunity? And the key word with that is opportunity, because I do find, unfortunately, that there still seems to be an emphasis on achievement gap. And I use that in air quotes because achievement gap implies there's some degree of a hierarchy, and that we need to bring those that are at a lower achievement level to the comparable level of those that are a higher achievement level. But it conveniently ignores the environment and the resources that are available. And that's precisely why I say it should be an opportunity gap, because I would argue that if students in different areas were provided the right degree of access and then opportunity, and then we can talk about how we measure achievement, because measuring achievement is very subjective. And I even share in several of my talks around the fact that our standardized tests, they are not necessarily written for every student to be successful. If you're you or me, those tests are not written for us to be successful. They do have a cultural bias, and who is applying value to what questions end up on the tests, and therefore what answers are appropriate, and things of that nature. So for me, equity is simply access and opportunity. And then once we can achieve that, then we'll start talking about, how do we measure success or measure academic learning and things of that nature.
And when we take a look at those standardized tests too, we're only measuring a small part of the whole student. And if we define what is true success, we're looking at a multitude of other skills. And we're talking about social emotional skills, which, by the way, last week on March 27th, it was International Social Emotional Learning Day. And, we've had a conversation about that. But there are this whole other subset of skills that we don't test, or we don't acknowledge, or show achievement or growth in, that are really the skills that we need to be successful as adults, as citizens, and in the workplace.
I 100% agree. And in fact, I could argue that I could write a test, let's say, to measure achievement, and I could add my own cultural bias to it, and students from certain zip codes here in California will perform very well on it, whereas those from other zip codes won't. And it really reminds me of back when I was in high school and how problematic for me the SAT was, and especially the verbal section. I did well on the math, but the verbal section, back then, I grew up in Los Angeles, an urban environment, had never been on a farm. And every time I was a question in the verbal section, whether it was reading or had some sort of a reference to a farm, and I'll never forget the use of the word silo. And it's like, I have no idea what that is. So how can you fairly gauge, my knowledge or my ability to perform, in this case, in the verbal section, when you're using terminology that I've never been exposed to before? And it wasn't because of anything that my teachers did. It was more so because of the environment that I grew up in. So, I think in terms of what we're talking about here, and I'm glad you did bring up the fact that last week was International SEL Day, Social and Emotional Learning Day, because I do think that there is an intersectionality between equity and social and emotional learning. And I'll even give you a short story around that. I remember, and I was actually going to include this in the keynote had we been face to face, but I remember in my AP American Lit class in high school, there were a couple of times where we're reading, and of course what we were reading were the classics, which is a whole nother component of a standardized curriculum that really needs to be looked at, and that's the literary canon, as far as what books are considered to be classics, who are the authors, what are the stories, why are they classics, and what other voices or representations are we excluding by only focusing on those. But I'll never forget having such a problem with, I know how to read, I understood language, I did well in my English classes, but for some reason, a lot of the text I was not able to understand. And now as an adult, I totally understand why, because there was a cultural disconnect. But where that ties in with the equity and the SEL component is I was never provided access or opportunity to read books of authors that looked like me, or stories that were at least more representational of mine. And then in turn, the SEL component is that I started doubting my own skills and myself because of that, and not understanding that it's not a deficit of me, it's a lack of a cultural connection to what was being assigned in the first place.
And that's so fascinating. You and I recently had the opportunity to see Chris Emdin speak together,
Yeah.
right? And in that conversation, it was a primarily white Anglo audience. And so interesting. So I've learned recently to describe it as humble means in my background, very humble means in my background, which
Yeah.
means there's a whole set of vocabulary words there too that the middle income family or upper socioeconomic income family might not know. And one of the words that Chris Emdin brought up was janky, right? And he said, how many of you know what janky is, right? And we watched, right? And we're looking at each other like, yeah, I totally know what janky is.
Yes,
Right?
exactly.
But then as we looked around us and we're like, oh my gosh, not that many other people are raising their hands, which I thought was fascinating, because imagine that being an SAT word.
Put that, yeah, exactly.
Right.
Put that on there. You and I.
Right,
Oh,
right,
this is
we're
easy. We
good.
know this. That's right. Yes.
I am now a high achiever.
Yeah.
When I got my first administrative position, it was with the County Office of Education, and one of the schools is in a low socioeconomic neighborhood, and I was very much in my roots and very comfortable driving through it, and I'm watching, there's like literally a couple of like side, deals going on selling some marijuana, and there's folks out in front, and this is going to be my vocabulary, drinking their 40s, right, out of
Yeah.
thank you for being with me on that. And I was like, oh, I'm in the business district, right? So, because we got a little business going on the side. And
Exactly.
so I go back to this meeting, and I'm describing to the other administrators who are, and God bless us all for, yes, white people are good people too. But we're all saying that they were all, the upper socioeconomic status. And so I roll in, and I'm just being Pam. And I was like, yeah, nobody told me that that school was in the business district. And they all looked at me and went, the business district? I'm like, little slide deals going on over there, and, folks, drinking their 40s. And everybody at the table looked at me like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And, and so there was this cultural divide, the socioeconomic cultural divide. And I do remember having this moment of like, oh my gosh, right? I did not change in and what's the term? It's slipping my mind right now. Where
Oh, you mean you didn't code switch?
I didn't code switch in
Yeah.
that moment, right? And
Yeah.
that failure to code switch, the anxiety that I felt inside, and the thought of, oh my gosh, what impression did I just make on these people, and how am I being judged, and the self-doubt that comes with that, and that happens to our kids all the time.
All the time. That. First of all, what you just described also is what I identify is two parts. One, it's a degree of unintentional but self-induced anxiety, which can then in turn lead to what I call the lower levels of trauma, because you think about how you felt internally and then what processes you went through mentally, to recognize that there was a cultural disconnect, that there was what I would say a terminology or vernacular disconnect, and then in turn you had to make the adjustment. And so this is where, and you shouldn't have to, and this is where I always, I encourage educators to one, understand what code switching is, and understand that that most of us do it, some more than others. My favorite question to ask a large audience when I'm talking about that is code switching cultural or is it geographical? And I think you and I have talked about this. And so, for those watching, it's actually both. And I have lots and lots of friends, for example, that live in other parts of the United States where they have a discernible accent that is identifiable to where they are geographically from. And usually that accent is associated, if you were to put together a hierarchy of intelligence, is usually associated lower on that hierarchy, just simply because of their accent. And so that's where I always, encourage educators, and it's something I used to do with my students all the time, is say, look, you want to understand the environment that you're in and be able to effectively navigate, contribute to, and communicate in that environment. When you're hanging out with your friends, you're going to use a different type of speech pattern and vernacular. And I'm not passing judgment on that, because that's what you do, because that's what I do. But you also have to understand that you might go into certain areas or spaces where that's not going to be effective in communicating. And you want to be able to effectively not only contribute to and be a part of it, but also obviously be able to communicate in it. So it's understanding of how to navigate between what space is appropriate for me to use a specific type of vernacular, maybe that of which I've grown up in, and what space is more around a different type of vernacular to use, so that you don't go through any degree of self-induced anxiety, and you're not constantly dealing with like I said, the low level of trauma of figuring out, okay, what did I say? Was it wrong? Did they understand me? Are they judging me? All those sorts of things. And it's all around, again, the vernacular that we use. And then I also encourage educators to not be, not tone police. Like when you hear kids on the yard using certain language, obviously if it's not profanity, which is a whole nother thing that I would say, it's interesting how judgment is passed on certain words, but not other words, especially other words that are generally used that people are now starting to find out are very offensive or hurtful or both. But it's being able to understand that, and then also being supportive of our students to basically say, okay, I'm not going to apply my assessment or judgment on your culture. I'm going to support you in understanding the differences of the spaces you're going to be in, so that you can effectively not just navigate in them, but contribute to them.
Right, so we're not disciplining students who don't code switch, because that does happen quite a bit. And when we take a
There you
look,
go.
right, when we take a look at what are the suspension rates for our students, right, and it's no accident that we see more boys, and we see, more of our Latino students and our African American students being suspended. I think there's a disconnect of understanding, and when we have that conversation about implicit bias, right? Those are those
Right.
things that we culturally don't understand, and therefore we place judgment on them because I'm uncomfortable because I'm not sure what's going on here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as a teacher, going into a classroom, and we have kids that come from different cultures and backgrounds, let's talk a little bit about what we can do to make ourselves more aware of what our implicit biases are, and how we address those in a way that we start connecting with our students with where they are at, so when they're not code switching and bringing behaviors and language that are okay at home into the classroom.
Yes. So I'm glad you brought that up. So a couple of things. One is, one of the slides that I actually wanted to had set up for what would have been the actual cue as opposed to virtual cue was a quote from a hip hop artist, Nipsey Hussle. And the quote basically is, if you look around and you're not inspired, you don't have a circle of friends, you have a cage. And so ultimately for me it's if you look around your friends, if you're not inspired, challenged, and grow, you don't have a circle, you have a cage. And so ultimately for educators, it's one, if you look at your circle of friends, is it based on proximity and convenience? So in other words, are my friends because these are the environments that I choose to be in, and therefore what is a proximity that I have to, let's just say, a diverse representation of friends? And so if that's the case, then the other layer to that is, how much are you reading and how much are you essentially consuming narratives that aren't representational of your circle of friends or your upbringing or your experience, to be able to say, okay, this is going to provide me with a window into perhaps the lives or the culture of many of my students. And I do want to emphasize one thing along those lines with that, because hopefully many of the viewers have heard the term mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. And it's something that I encourage educators to do all the time, is they need to cite the source. So I'm going to cite the source. That comes from Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, who is at the Ohio State University. Added to that is Dr. Debbie Reese, who is a First Nations, Native People, or Indigenous professor as well. She added that the windows also can have curtains, because not every culture is open for you to just simply look into. You have to go through the effort to move the curtains out of the way, i.e. understand the culture better before you get a window into that culture. And I'm mentioning those two because part of what I see also is the reference to a lot of these phrases and terms and things without citing the source. And think about what that does to, in this case, you have an African American and a Native person, professor, who, if you don't cite their sources, and theoretically cite them as a source, you're silencing them. So there's that degree of marginalization with that. So
That's
in
powerful.
addition to that, yes, and in addition to that, for any educators who say, okay, I don't have a circle of friends who are representational of the students that I have, then I would ask, what books are you providing yourself access to? What spaces are you looking at learning from? And here's the key: do not burden those that are representational of that group with teaching you. You have to do
Oh,
the work yourself.
amen, right?
You have
Yeah.
to. And in fact, I always say, in order to understand equity and inclusion, you must become an equitable and inclusive person. And so that's where I just encourage educators. You know, I wrote a series of blog posts, and I share with many of my friends podcasts and all kinds of things where they're and no, they don't burden me. They're just like, you know what should I read and what should I listen to? That is not putting a burden on me to teach them. That is them saying, I'm going through the effort. I don't know of all of the resources, but because I know that you read a lot and you listen to podcasts a lot, is there something that you would say, this is something of great value to me in my growth as a human being first, and then also obviously as a more equitable and inclusive educator? And I really think that, like, and you brought up an important point as well, that equity is still looked at as a buzzword, but I'm really hopeful that, you know, as we do more things around equity and inclusion and more educators are exposed to it, they recognize the need for growth in that area. They recognize that we have certain status quo systems in place that need to be dismantled, that equity is not a buzzword, that there are lots of things that I can even cite in that, and even you just shared as well, that you and I can go back to early part of our career or even our upbringing where it was important even back then. Now, I'm not going to say what decade that was, but but I think it is important for all of us to look at, you know, that our growth as educators, you know, and I love asking a whole audience, you know, who considers themselves a lifelong learner? And every time I ask that question, everyone's hand goes up. Perfect. So then I follow up with saying, then we need to look at ourselves as lifelong learners and look at that journey as a marathon, not a sprint. And here's the key: whoever crosses the finish line first is not the winner. We all have to cross the finish line. So therefore, it's a group community effort based on what the individuals are doing, not any one person who's going to be better than the others.
And as we educate ourselves, those implicit biases become reduced, our practices change, and the impact we have on our students and our families and communities change, right? So that gradually we are starting to reduce those within the system. And I so appreciate you saying it's a marathon, not a sprint, because changing values and getting people to really understand from, you know, both heart and mind what this is doesn't happen quickly, and it really takes generations for this to occur.
It does. And, you know, and the other thing I always encourage educators to do, because as far as biases go, we all have them. And sometimes it's not easy, especially implicit. Those are the ones that are a byproduct of the stimuli that we've consumed and the environments that we are in. I always encourage educators, you know, go to the Harvard implicit bias test and take that, and then do it again, you know, maybe in a month, and see how things have changed. And then also at the Ohio State University, the Kirwan Institute, they have implicit bias tests. And then MTV did something with Look, if I remember correctly, it's lookdifferent.org, where they have, it's an LGBTQ, race, and gender. Those are the three. I think there's a fourth one, but I remember those three, where if you sign up and you just get an email, and it'll do a thing like one that I bring up, and people don't realize it, that the names of hurricanes, the most powerful hurricanes, have female names.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right. Hurricane
And it's like,
Katrina.
I mean, though, even just something as little as that, you know, and it's interesting how all of those things can frame our thinking. And ultimately, there's another thing. I know I'm throwing a lot of different readings and stuff, but one of my favorite readings is by Claude Steele, called Whistling Vivaldi. And ultimately, what he talks about in it is what's called stereotype threats. And ultimately, we generate stereotypes about people that are a byproduct of our biases. And then in many cases, those stereotypes can actually serve as a threat rather than a way of bringing us in.
Very much so. You know, along the lines of books that we've read and, you know, that help us change our thinking, because you and I are both connected educators, right? We spend a lot of time in different platforms learning from other educators and being really comfortable getting into the uncomfortable.
Yes.
It's like I'm not afraid to jump in there. And the book White Fragility has become popular, it's become a bestseller. And I will say I was nervous
Okay.
going into reading it. And because I did have a sense of, oh, I'm going to be lectured as I go through this, and it's not what happened. And there were points at the beginning of the book that I thought, okay, wait a minute, hang on, right? Because I was looking at it from my personal point of view. But then the scope of the book broadened up into the systems,
Yep.
right? And let's take a look at this from the systems impact, and thus the power. When you truly look at how are our systems designed, how are they impacting the people that are working in our profession, how are they impacting our students, our parents' ability to access resources, and teachers develop community and relationship. And that was powerful and unexpected.
Yeah, Dr. D'Angelo is, she's amazing. I have read the book. I do recommend the book. I recommend a series of books, and that is one of them. And you're right. And ultimately, we talked about one system, which is the way standardized testing works.
Mm-hmm.
And the other idea that I at least emphasize to educators, especially school and school district leaders, is around looking at three big areas. So one is, the use of what I call deficit language.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a child at 5 years old and you're constantly told you're less than, you're not good enough, you need this, you need that, you're not going to be blank. And then over the course of, the next 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13 years, if that's the constant messaging that you're getting, first of all, what does that do to your own views of yourself and your own psyche? But also, in addition to that being one, the other thing is that there's an awful lot of emphasis placed on the individuals rather than the institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I always caution educators that, when you look in terms of, again, achievement gap. Well, if we want to talk about the achievement gap, which again, remember I said is not an achievement gap, it's an opportunity gap. So let's look at the achievement gap. Okay, so what are the books that are being assigned? What is the access being provided? What are the opportunities being provided? How many resources are being provided? And that's why we could look at so many different schools and so many different zip codes. And it's something I absolutely despise is the predictability of success. I know this because I know there's a limited access and limited opportunity, yet it's hidden behind the achievement gap. And thirdly, it's looking at some of the this is a hot button thing, and I know, and I love engaging in conversation with educators around, is using words like growth mindset and grit.
Mm-hmm.
Those are arbitrary terms that are subjectively applied, and the reason why I caution educators on that is grit in one student in a high socioeconomic neighborhood is not going to be the same as grit in another student in a low socioeconomic neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with growth mindset. All of those things, if you conveniently ignore the environmental structure as well as the institutional structures when you're applying those terms, then you're actually doing more harm than you are good. It creates a false narrative and a false sense of hope that many students either recognize quite quickly, or by the time they walk the stage, it's like, well, wait a minute, I played the game correctly, followed all the rules, I did all the things I was supposed to. Why am I still not being provided the same opportunities as those that I know have, quote unquote, worked hard? And it's not cool to do that. And I hope that educators start to recognize that a lot of these terms are convenient, just like we were saying, convenient buzzwords. And if they're absent of any contextual and localized reference, i.e. not culturally responsive, then they're actually doing harm. They're just flat out, you're doing harm to kids.
Well, and so much of that also, I think, falls onto the responsibility of our legislatures
Oh,
as
yeah.
they put forth these laws that we then have to abide by, that embed that systemic bias into a system that in order to keep our jobs, we have to abide by, right? Because
Yeah,
if you push too far out of that, we see people getting in trouble, being professionally isolated,
Yeah.
outright losing their jobs. And the reality is that the system has created these, right? I have to teach to these standards for my students to be successful on this test, even if I can see that I have students in my classroom who, if I meet them where they're at, instead of teaching these standards that haven't taken the opportunity to say, what is the opportunity gap between the time that my student was preparing to enter school and is now in school?
Right.
How do I first address that, right? But we jump straight into, let's get you ready for this test and call it an achievement gap, rather
Right.
than, as you know, I love the term that you use, an opportunity gap.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, well, this is one of the reasons why I love being in a position to be able to having done and continue to do some degree of work at the policy level.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and you brought up an important point. I mean, even when I look at the standards, I mean, many of the standards, I don't see access or opportunity for, let's just say, some of the narratives that are aligned, even honestly, even with my personal family history. I mean, I share this in my talks, and many of the viewers who have seen it before. I even talk about the fact that in my AP US history class, where the teacher, will never forget him. And I also add the fact that this is why I emphasize that childhood trauma lasts a lifetime,
Mm-hmm.
because I still remember all of these things like it was yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember doing a project where we had to do, it was a research project on a US history topic of your choosing. And the story that I share with that is the fact that I chose to do a report on World War II, or more specifically the Tuskegee Airmen, because at the time, my uncle, my great uncle, and then two of the best friends of my paternal grandfather who had passed away prior to that, they were all in World War II. They were all Tuskegee Airmen. And so I had access to three primary sources. And if you count my grandmother, not primary, but pretty darn close to
Mm-hmm.
primary. And of course, that's not in the curriculum. And when I turned in that big research project, of which I had interviewed three primary sources, and I even and keep in mind, they were in the military when it was segregated, it became integrated. My whole questions, a lot of the stuff I did was around what was it like fighting in the war, knowing that your return to this country, you were not going to be granted full rights as a citizen, and even going even further than that, why many of their fellow servicemen didn't get their GI Bill, or why they didn't go to college even though they got their GI Bill, because you had a lot of predominantly white universities that would not accept it, which
Mm-hmm.
was led to an expansion of HBCUs and things like that. But all these things were in that. And I just remember the teacher not only giving me a C on it, but basically telling me this is not consistent with what we studied. That was literally what he wrote on it. See, I remember it like it was yesterday. Okay. Now, why is that the case? Well, one, that's not in the curriculum, it's not in the standards. And two, for that teacher, it was grossly irresponsible because one, the reaction should have been, this isn't in the curriculum, you cited your sources, tell me more. But instead it was, it's not in the curriculum. So what he did was he essentially marginalized me and my family history. And,
Well, a
and then
large
of
part
course,
of history in general of our country, right? A very
history in
important
general,
part
that's right,
of the
that's
history of our
right.
country.
That's
Mm-hmm.
right. And so then of course, I was angry, and and it bothered me for a long time, long time. I mean, I would say I got over it, but you shouldn't have to endure those things. That was been a perfect opportunity to say, you know what, this is not something that's part of the standardized curriculum. You cited your sources. I'd love for you to share more about your family history with the class. Now, the
Mm-hmm.
other thing I'll share with you is that I was the only African-American male student in the class. In fact, I was the only male student of color in the class. So there's a whole
There's a whole nother
additional
thing going
layer.
on there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. There is. And so for me, in terms of what you shared when we started this conversation around things like equity, that's where technology can democratize the access and the opportunity to that type of information and those types of narratives, to where they're not seen as an anomaly. They become normalized as a part of the curriculum. So for me, when I taught history for a while, the questions I would always ask are things like, what stories are missing?
Yes.
Whose voices are we not hearing from? How do we include those within a context of what we're doing? And so that's one of the things I share with teachers, where, to the point you made, where, well, I have to follow these standards. I'm like, okay, well, here's how you can weave being culture responsive and culturally relevant into those standards by asking yourself, whose voices are missing, whose stories are being marginalized. How can we include those within a context of what we are studying? How can we provide, multiple perspectives on the same thing, especially a perspective from those of a marginalized identity? And so that's how you can say, okay, you know what? Are you teaching the standards? Yeah, I'm including a little bit more too.
Right. And so we have had that shift where from content standards to skill-based standards. So we have more
Yeah.
flexibility in the curriculum that's being used. And I remember, and I'll go back decades, back in the 90s, right, where we started bringing in books like Lupita Mañana and Esperanza Rising. There are several other ones. Gosh, boy, they're not all popping off the top of my head, but what a
Well, even
difference.
the house on Mango Street.
Oh, that is one of my
Same here.
favorites.
Yep.
That's so, oh, right, so good, right? And there was that time where we started bringing in that literature, and we have that opportunity now to take a look at all of the cultures that so impact our society and that are so much a part of our country, and then apply the standards, the skill-based standards, to
That's
that
right.
wide variety of representation.
Right.
So do you have resources or places where people can look to say, hey, you know what, I'm reflecting now and I'm realizing, oh my gosh, I've got this textbook which has all the same stories in it that it has for the last 20, 30, 40 years. Where do I go to find stories and books
Yeah.
and literature and narrative and history where I can apply the standards but give my students this broader perspective?
Right. So I did a 4-part series blog posting on my website around it was titled "The Pathway to Being Better and Doing Better," which is loosely lifted from one of my favorites of all time, Maya Angelou, which is
Yes.
her quote is, "Do the best you can until you know better, and when you know better, do better." So that's why I say it's a pathway on knowing better and doing better. Um, and it's in 4 thematic areas. So the first area are the telescopes. So they're basically historical narratives that is information that has been kept at a distance from us, i.e., the events and occurrences have happened, but the curriculum has kept them inaccessible to us. So with a telescope, we can now see them.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a whole list of those. The next one are the which I'm called the microscopes, which is more of a more deeply rooted analysis of many of our systems and institutions that currently exist that perpetuate the marginalization or the exclusion, if you will, of certain narratives. Then there's the mirrors, which is, for example, Dr. D'Angelo's book is in the mirrors, and that I'm holding a mirror up to myself to get a better understanding of who I am, what is my role in society, how can I be more mindful of the thinking gaps that I have, or take more actionable steps in doing these things that I know are going to be the right things for the right reasons, of which includes one of my favorite books that I recommend I think it should be required reading by every educator, period. And that is Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Dr. Beverly Tatum. And she talks about in that book, she uses an analogy, which I actually had a video on slides for this too. She's an analogy that life is a moving sidewalk. And there are those that benefit from it that walk with it, and it's accelerated. There are those that want to maintain the status quo or are complicit and they stand still. But guess what? It's still moving. We have to actively turn around and go against it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where you go into the mirrors of what is my role? What is my understanding of myself? How do I examine some of my degrees of implicit bias, recognizing that it is not a one-time thing, it is an ongoing thing. And then now what can I do to be actionable in making changes to myself that then result in changes to my role as a contributor to society or as an educator? And then the last group is the magnifying glasses and binoculars, which are small snippets of things like I have podcast episodes in there. I have links to different articles that are posted online. I mean, all those sorts of things. So I have a list of those. Some of my other favorite resources to share with educators are, I love Teaching Tolerance,
Oh, yes.
for sure.
Mm-hmm.
They do a great job putting stuff out that is easily incorporated into the curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
I would say my top 3 podcasts, one that I think is good for educators that I do have some episodes listed on my website. One is Code Switch. It's an NPR podcast. That's one of my favorites. The other one is Revisionist History, which is Malcolm Gladwell.
Mm-hmm.
Those are 2 that I always recommend to educators. And there's a bunch of others that I actually had the privilege of being guests on. but ultimately it's still, regardless of what the resource is, the most important thing is the acknowledgement that I have biases, the awareness that my biases can perhaps be an inhibitor to a pathway for success for my students, my staff, my district, and then taking that first step. And that's why I always share with any educator, that first step you have to take alone, but you don't have to do the journey alone. And I'm always there with you. And there's a whole community of educators who, and I'm not the only voice, but there's a whole community of educators that are like, look, you know what, we can all do better. We can all be better. And ultimately it will benefit our students. And the more that we can do that, the more we can begin to dismantle some of the structural things like the school to prison pipeline or the lack of representations in our colleges and universities. I will tell you, I'm a big advocate for CTE programs as well, big advocate for CTE programs. I don't think that the only pathway for our students is college. I think that is a pathway, but there's other things that we need to do. And the interesting thing is when I've had conversations with some educators, like, no, everyone should go to college. And I'm like, when your toilet doesn't work, who are you going to call? Are you going to call a college graduate or are you going to call a plumber? Okay.
Well, and let's take a look at those business owners, right? Because I know that, we've got people living in our neighborhood that are wildly financially more successful than we are. And I'm like, oh, you own the electrical business, right? You own the plumbing business. All right, I gotcha. Right?
That's right. That's right. So my whole thing is when a student walks across the stage, how much access and opportunity do they have for IE options? That's it. They could be college, they could be a technical program, they could be in a position where they say, you know what, because of this, let's say CTE program, I now am going to apply for a small business loan and I'm going to do this. I mean, the whole point is they need to have those options. And I also want to add to our recording that it was something that you and I had the opportunity when we listened to Dr. Chris Emden. I really love the fact, and it's something I included in one of my recent talks, which I'll pull it up real quick and say it. But ultimately, it's where he had said that, if you really want to gauge the impact, value, and experience of students in your school or your school district, interview those that have dropped out, interview those that are incarcerated, because that means that the system has failed them, period. We should look at every time a student turns 18 and they don't have options, we should look at that as something happened in their schooling, i.e. the system, that didn't meet their needs. And so for me, and the term is Eseria Nakera, Eserian, and then Nakera, Nakera. That's what they say, and that loosely translates to, and how are the children? So that's a question I would say every educator should ask themselves before every day, before every school year, and every leader. Eseria Nakera, and how are the children? And they gauge the health of the community based on how that question is answered. And ideally, the answer is the children are well. So if we start looking at grading our schools, if you will, which I don't mean grading with a letter, but I mean like the value of our school and the health of our school, the social and emotional health, the academic access and opportunity, the overall experience of our student by the answer to that question, and how are the children? And ideally, everyone who's watching this and every leader, school or district leader, can start taking the steps and making decisions, policy even decisions, to where they can answer the children are well.
Right. And what does it say when the answer is not that
Exactly.
our children are well?
And now you know what areas of growth you need to make, what areas of professional learning need to happen, and what areas of need you need to allocate resources to.
Right. And what are the pain points within the community, whether it's a local community or a subgroup within the community or within the school community? It's very powerful to take a look at those kiddos. And
Exactly.
That's a great question. How are the children?
Yeah.
That's powerful. That makes me catch my breath.
Eseria Nakera.
I'm not going to butcher it because it's too beautiful.
All good.
The
The
term is too
English.
beautiful.
We'll just stick to the English of that. But yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what we should always ask ourselves.
Very much so. Gosh, and that impacts our whole society. If we start every single day with how are the children, and there are some teachers that do that, right? That kiddos come in the classroom in the morning and they do point to, a face that says, here's how I am. And we have teachers that use that to guide the beginning of the day to find out what happened before you ever showed up here, so that I can meet your needs and whether or not you're actually ready to learn, or if there's something else that needs to happen before your mind and your body are in that place to accept the learning, right? Whether it's surface
The
level
learning,
learning
that's
or
right.
the
That's
deeper
right.
learning. Because if we are not well, we can't
We aren't
learn.
learning.
We
No,
can't.
yeah, no,
And as
no.
we go through this time right now, I think as leaders we also have to ask, how are our teachers?
Bingo. Let's talk SEL. Yep. I'm glad you brought that up. Yes. So for your listeners, there is no social emotional learning program or platform is effective or sustainable if it doesn't meet the following three conditions. And I stress it. Three conditions. One, it must include anti-bias, anti-racist training that is continuous and ongoing. It must provide students agency and empowerment, and it must meet the needs of the adults also. If the adults cannot be their whole selves, then the kids are not getting the best of the adults, and therefore it becomes this cycle of trauma and this cycle of need that is not being met, and then no one wins in that. Those three things are critical to any social and emotional learning program. If you have a program that is absent of any one, or even worse, all three, you don't have an effective or sustainable social and emotional learning program, period.
That's interesting. And Ken, I'm going to drop in there also the question of we look at and as we talk about this, how are our leaders? Right now, I read the judgment, on social media feeds of our chief technology officers, our assistant superintendents, and our superintendents across our country, and nobody prepared them for a global pandemic and how to offer instruction and how to quickly roll out devices and understand cybersecurity and online instruction, and who's taking care of them,
Right.
right? Who's taking care of them, and who knows what that heavy lift is. I know I've been connecting with some of my colleagues, from my time in that position, and they're showing up to the office still so early in the morning, and they're late at night. And one of my girlfriends from high school is now an assistant superintendent, focusing on curriculum and instruction. And her mom brought her dinner in her office at 9 o'clock the other night because she's still working to support her teachers to be able to get instruction
Right.
out to students. And at the same time, I've heard teachers in the district criticize her. And I thought, oh my gosh, how quickly do we expect them to be able to pivot and get resources when they just aren't available? And are we as teachers, as outside professionals, giving them the love and support and the grace that they need to have the strength to lead and to get us what we then in turn need as well?
I couldn't agree more. Remember that third of the SEL?
Mm-hmm.
What about the adults? And that, when I say adults, it's adults across the entire spectrum. I had, speaking, referencing the conference that you and I were together at, I did have an opportunity to have one-on-one discussions with quite a few superintendents while I was there. And what was one of many things that stood out to me that really gave me pause, because I kind of knew it.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things where you kind of know, but when someone shares it with you and from their perspective and their, essentially their narrative that essentially validates what you kind of knew, I won't say that it gave me a degree of relief. It gave me a further degree of pause, where in many cases, many of the superintendents, their experience and their roles or their positions mirrored what it was for me being the only Black male teacher at the schools that I worked at, as far as you can't talk to someone down the hallway.
Mm-hmm.
You do feel like you're working in isolation. In many cases, the day-to-day work that you do to make sure that everything is runs smoothly is often overlooked. There's always the negative or punitive ways that things are looked at. And I do think, look, I hope that after all this is all said and done, that we as an educational community collectively start to really push back on all of the heavy mandates that conveniently ignore all of our social and emotional health.
Mm-hmm.
To say, look, you know what? We're not doing those things anymore, because ultimately, again, I go back to my statement. If you can't be your whole self, then those that you work with, whether it's leaders, site leaders, teachers, student, they're not going to get the best out of you. And then ultimately we all lose on that. So I really hope that we all start to band together as a community and start saying, okay, you know what? Equity is not a buzzword.
Mm-hmm.
We need to address it. Digital equity is not a buzz phrase. We need to address it. I mean, I'm talking with many of my friends now that work in urban and rural areas where they're having challenges. Okay. That's not a buzz phrase.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to look at what are we doing to take care of ourselves? Because ultimately that's what's most important to me. We'll get to the curriculum and the learning, but you can't do that until after you do these things first.
And let these things be first, and helping our teachers and our administrators understand that it is okay to walk away. It's okay to go outside for a walk, right?
Exactly.
It is okay if that's your student doesn't finish a packet of work, right? Because right now there are other things that are happening within the home, that all of these things are okay, and that the greatest gift we have to give one another is grace.
Exactly.
Yeah. So,
Grace and support. Yep. I agree.
so as we get ready to close out today, Ken, there's a lot of meaty conversation in here and meaty concepts that we dove into around equity, what it is, tequity, what that is, the words that are sort of buzzwords right now, but really have a far deeper meaning and impact than just this moment, but they're part of our structures and our systems, and that we need to continue to address them after we come out of this global pandemic, this crisis that we're in. And to one of the most powerful points that I think you make is, let's not just talk about the achievement gap, but let's first and foremost talk about the opportunity gap. Because when we close the opportunity gap, we're going to close the achievement gap, while also being
Correct.
mindful of what are we measuring as success.
Yep. Exactly.
So thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate this time. I hope everyone who's watching will gain not just value out of our conversation, but it will be a catalyst for that first step. And remember, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And this is not a race of which there are winners and losers. When we all cross the finish line, we all win.
Absolutely. So for those of you that have tuned in to our final keynote of Spring Q, I'd like to invite you to connect with Ken on Twitter. Fantastic information, a wonderful way to stay in touch with him. Take a look at his website, take a look at the resources that he offers, one bite at a time. The last couple of weeks have brought us a lot of information from how the mind and the brain work in online instruction. We've talked about tools that we can use in digital media, increasing our skills in these areas. We've talked about really in-depth instruction with our students to make deep learning happen. And we've had this powerful conversation about equity and how we adjust our systems and our structures. It's a lot. So take one bite, take a piece, get comfortable with it, and then dive in for more learning. Thank you for joining us for Virtual Spring Q, and we hope to see you in Palm Springs next year.